The last bell rang at 5:47 in the morning. Not a gentle chime. A wave. A physical force that rolled across the rooftops of Lyon, France, passed through the stone walls of 400-year-old buildings, and settled into the bones of every sleeping person within 3 miles. By noon, it was gone. Melted. Poured into molds for something the government called the national interest. The year was 1919. The war had been over for 8 months. And yet the confiscation orders were accelerating. Here is what the history books will tell you: Europe was devastated. Resources were scarce. Metal was needed for reconstruction, for rebuilding what 4 years of industrialized warfare had destroyed. The bells were a sacrifice. A necessary one. Here is what the history books won't tell you: 3 weeks after French authorities removed the bells from over 8,000 churches, the government rejected a proposal to use the 200,000 tons of steel and iron abandoned across the former battlefields of the Somme. The metal was already there. Processed. Waiting. They didn't want it. They wanted the bells. And when you understand why, you will never listen to silence the same way again. Let's go back further. Much further. Before the electric grid. Before the combustion engine. Before the telegraph turned the world into a network of wire and signal. In the medieval period, a city wasn't defined by its skyline. It was defined by its soundscape. And at the center of that soundscape, physically and acoustically, stood the bell tower. Not because of religion. Or rather, not only because of religion. The placement of bell towers followed patterns that architects today struggle to explain. The towers weren't simply tall. They were proportioned. The interior chambers were shaped according to mathematical ratios that acoustic engineers now recognize as resonance amplifiers. The stone chosen for construction was selected based on density and reflective properties. The height, consistently between 50 and 80 meters across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, matched the optimal elevation for broadcasting low-frequency sound across a radius of approximately 5 to 7 miles. This wasn't coincidence. The bells themselves were cast using formulas that had been refined over centuries. The alloy was typically 80% copper to 20% tin, bell bronze, a composition that produces what acousticians call a complex harmonic series. When struck, a large bell doesn't produce a single note. It produces a fundamental frequency and a cascade of overtones that interact with each other, with the tower's resonant cavity, and with the physical structures of the surrounding environment. The Campanone di Milano, cast in 1582, weighed 26 metric tons. Suspended 67 meters above ground, when it rang at its fundamental frequency of approximately 432 Hz, the sound reached measurable intensity at distances of over 6 miles. 432 Hz. Keep that number. We'll come back to it. Here's where the story changes. In 1939, a German physicist named Hans Jenny conducted a series of experiments that would later be classified under the field he named cymatics, the study of visible sound. Jenny suspended fine particles on metal plates and exposed them to various frequencies. What he documented was extraordinary: sound doesn't just travel through matter. At specific frequencies, it organizes matter. The particles arranged themselves into precise geometric patterns, circles within circles, lattices, spirals, patterns that appeared in nature, in snowflakes, in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, in the growth structure of coral. The patterns weren't random. They were frequency-specific. Different tones produced different geometries. And the geometry produced by frequencies in the range of 432 Hz was among the most complex and most stable. Jenny's work wasn't the beginning of this understanding. It was the rediscovery. Pythagoras had described what he called the music of the spheres, the mathematical relationship between sound frequencies and natural forms, in the 6th century BC. Cymatics wasn't a new discovery. It was an old one, forgotten and then rediscovered by someone who bothered to look. The question is, who else was looking? And what did they do with what they found? Now we need to look at the numbers. The real numbers. Not the ones in the commemorative plaques. Between 1917 and 1935, approximately 1 million bells were removed from towers across Europe. That estimate comes from a 1947 survey by the International Congress of Bell Founders, an organization that had obvious reasons to document the scope of what had been lost. 1 million. To put that in physical terms, if you laid those bells end to end, they would stretch from Paris to Moscow. The combined weight of bronze removed exceeded 400,000 metric tons. That is not a wartime salvage operation. That is a systematic dismantling of infrastructure. But here is what the number doesn't capture. It's not just the quantity. It's the geography. It's the timing. It's the political impossibility of what happened. France began removals in 1918. Germany began in 1917. Russia began in 1922. England accelerated removals between 1920 and 1935. The United States began its program in 1929. France and Germany were at war with each other. Germany and Russia were ideological enemies. England and Russia were locked in what historians call the Great Game, decades of geopolitical competition across 3 continents. These nations agreed on almost nothing. But somehow, simultaneously, using different justifications, wartime necessity, ideological purification, economic modernization, structural safety, they all converged on the same target. The bells. Let's examine each justification carefully. Germany's program was called the Glockenfriedhof, the Bell Cemetery. Between 1917 and 1942, approximately 90,000 bells were removed in 3 distinct waves. The first wave was 1917 to 1918. Wartime. That fits. Steel was needed, bronze was available, the logic is coherent. But the second wave ran from 1922 to 1925. Germany in 1922 was not at war. The Versailles Treaty had stripped the German military of its capacity to produce munitions. There was no operational weapons program. Bronze was militarily useless, modern artillery shells require hardened steel, aircraft require aluminum alloys. Even the most basic analysis of World War I munitions production confirms that bell bronze had no practical military application. And yet the removals not only continued, they accelerated. The Soviet program is even more revealing. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the new government launched what historians call the League of Militant Atheists campaign. Churches were nationalized, clergy were imprisoned, religious symbols were destroyed. The bells were removed from towers across the Soviet Union between 1922 and 1930. The official justification was ideological. The bells represented the old religious order. They had to go. But stop and think about what that actually means. If you want to silence a church, you simply don't ring the bells. If you want to erase religious symbolism, you close the church. You convert the building. You demolish it. The Soviet government did all of these things. But they also did something else. Something the ideological explanation doesn't account for. They specifically melted the bells. Not locked away. Not displayed as trophies of the defeated old order. Not repurposed as functional objects. Melted. Destroyed at the molecular level. The bronze from thousands of Russian church bells was not repurposed for Soviet industry. The records are clear, a significant portion was simply dumped. Discarded. The metal itself wasn't the point. The silence was the point. England's approach was subtler. Which is perhaps more damning. Between 1920 and 1935, thousands of historic bells were removed under what was described as modernization programs. The stated reason: the old bells were structurally hazardous. Too heavy for aging towers. Expensive to maintain. Candidates for replacement with smaller, lighter, more manageable instruments. This sounds reasonable. Until you look at the towers. Many of the towers from which bells were removed have been holding those bells for 400, 500, 600 years. They had survived the English Civil War. They had survived the Great Fire of London. They had survived structural shifts, subsidence, centuries of weathering. The structural risk had existed, if it existed at all, for centuries. Why did it suddenly become urgent in 1920? Because in 1920, something else was becoming urgent. The electrical grid was expanding. Radio broadcasting was in its infancy but growing rapidly. The infrastructure of electromagnetic communication, telegraph, telephone, early radio, was being built across England, across Europe, across the developed world. And large bronze bells, ringing at specific frequencies, produced something that electrical engineers in the early 20th century were very aware of: electromagnetic interference. A 20-ton bell ringing at 432 Hz doesn't just produce sound. It produces vibration. Mechanical vibration at that scale, in a metal object of that mass, generates a measurable electromagnetic field. Across a network of hundreds of bells in a single city, the aggregate electromagnetic signature was significant. Significant enough to disrupt early radio signals. Significant enough to be a problem for anyone trying to build a centralized communication infrastructure. Here is the thread that runs through every country, every justification, every program. The year that France completed its major removal program. The year Germany's second wave ended. The year the United States began its own program, conveniently timed to coincide with the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, when a population in financial freefall doesn't question the loss of what can be framed as an unnecessary luxury. In 1929, the International Electrotechnical Commission standardized radio frequency allocations across 34 nations. The global radio spectrum was being carved up, assigned, regulated, controlled. A competing acoustic broadcast system, one that operated on frequencies below the regulated radio spectrum, one that could not be owned or licensed or switched off, one that had been operational for centuries without any central authority controlling its content, was a problem. Not a religious problem. Not a cultural problem. A technical problem with a political dimension. You cannot charge a subscription fee for the sound of a bell. You cannot regulate its content. You cannot prevent it from crossing borders, from reaching people in their homes, from resonating at frequencies that, according to emerging research in the 1920s, appeared to have measurable effects on human physiology. On heart rate. On neural oscillation. On the subjective experience of calm. A technology that kept populations calm and connected, that operated outside the market, that could not be monetized, was not compatible with the economic and political architecture being built in the early 20th century. So they melted it. But something survived. Not the bells themselves. The knowledge. In the 1990s, researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics began studying what they called the psychoacoustic effects of low-frequency resonance. They were building on decades of earlier work that had been published in obscure journals, buried in academic archives, not cited, not taught. What they found was this: exposure to complex harmonic tones in the frequency range of 400 to 450 Hz produced measurable changes in cortisol levels, the primary stress hormone. Measurable changes in heart rate variability. Measurable changes in the electroencephalographic signatures associated with what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the state of mind associated with rest, integration, and what researchers carefully describe as enhanced perceptual coherence. The science is careful. The language is measured. But what it describes is something that people in pre-industrial Europe apparently experienced every morning, for centuries, for free. And the science also documents something else. A finding that appeared in a 2018 study on urban stress and acoustic environments that received almost no media attention. Cities with high ambient low-frequency noise, traffic rumble, industrial vibration, HVAC hum, showed measurably higher rates of anxiety disorders, sleep disruption, and what the researchers called chronic low-grade arousal, a persistent neurological state of alertness that never fully resolves. The human nervous system, operating in a frequency environment it did not evolve in, cannot fully switch off. That state of chronic low-grade arousal has a name in marketing and economics. It's called receptivity. A nervous system that cannot fully rest is a nervous system that is available. Searching. Responsive to stimulus. Responsive to advertising. To ideology. To the ambient signals of consumer culture. You cannot sell calm to someone who is already calm. There is a village in the Swiss Alps called Grindelwald. In 1923, the local church received orders to remove its bell, a bronze instrument cast in 1487, over 4 centuries old. The bell weighed approximately 3 tons. The tower had held it for 436 years without incident. The parish refused. The bell still hangs in the tower of the Grindelwald parish church. It still rings at 6 in the morning. At noon. At 6 in the evening. People who live in Grindelwald describe the experience in ways that sound strange to modern ears. They talk about a quality of the air in the village that is difficult to name. A kind of density. A groundedness. Scientists would call it a specific acoustic environment with measurable psychoacoustic properties. The villagers just call it home. There are approximately 30,000 historic bells still operational in Europe. They are protected now, by cultural heritage legislation, by UNESCO designations, by the bureaucratic weight of institutional preservation. They are safe. But they are also isolated. The network is gone. The coordinated ringing that turned a continent's morning into a single acoustic event, the overlapping frequencies, the harmonic interference patterns, the citywide resonance fields, that system no longer exists. What remains are fragments. Beautiful fragments. Preserved in isolation, studied occasionally, appreciated as heritage. Not understood as technology. Stand in any major city today at 6 in the morning. Listen to what you hear. Traffic. The distant rhythm of construction. The hum of refrigeration units. The pulse of electrical infrastructure vibrating at 50 or 60 cycles per second, depending on which part of the world you're standing in. All of it electromagnetic. All of it owned. All of it generating revenue for someone. Now try to imagine what it sounded like to stand in that same city 150 years ago. The same streets. The same morning light. But the air alive with bronze. Not just one bell. Dozens. Hundreds. Each one tuned to frequencies that had been refined over generations. Each one placed in a tower designed to amplify and project that sound into the surrounding environment. Each one part of a network that no one owned, that no one could switch off, that anyone within earshot received whether they had paid for it or not. The question isn't why they destroyed it. The question is simpler than that. The question is, what were they afraid of? A population that starts every morning with a physical experience of resonance. Of coherence. Of something that works on the body below the level of thought, below the level of belief, below the level of ideology. A population that is, by the design of their acoustic environment, regularly returned to a state of physiological calm. That population is harder to frighten. Harder to divide. Harder to sell things to. Harder to move with manufactured urgency. The bells weren't silenced because they were old. They weren't silenced because they were heavy, or expensive, or structurally risky, or symbolically inconvenient. They were silenced because silence is easier to fill. And someone had very specific plans for what to fill it with. The bronze is still out there. Scattered across landfill sites and museum collections and private foundries, incorporated into objects that no longer remember what they were. But the knowledge of what those bells did, the acoustic principles, the frequency relationships, the architectural specifications of the towers that made them work, that knowledge is still in libraries. Still in the archives of bell foundries that survived the 20th century. Still in the measurements of the bells that were preserved, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Some people are asking. In 2021, a consortium of acoustic engineers and architects published a proposal for what they called a resonant urban soundscape project, the deliberate reintroduction of low-frequency harmonic sound into city environments. Not for religious purposes. For neurological ones. The proposal cited 47 peer-reviewed studies. It was funded to a pilot stage. Then the funding was quietly redirected. The project is on hold. The silence continues. For now.